Hello, everyone. I am Victoria Sork, Dean of Life Sciences at UCLA, and I'm proud to say it is the home of the Psychology Department. I'd like to welcome you to our special virtual event, Illuminating Healthy Aging, featuring some of our remarkable faculty in the Department of Psychology. This seminar series, hosted by the Department of Psychology, is intended to spark new conversations about topics including racism, anxiety and depression, addiction, adolescent brain development and behavior, bullying, and stress. Today's topic is healthy aging. Before I introduce you to today's moderator, Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychology, Dr. Annette Stanton, please allow me the opportunity to share my pride in UCLA Psychology faculty and students. Here at UCLA, we have some of the world's foremost experts in psychology, neuroscience, and brain health. They are conducting innovative and impactful research on a range of topics such as how the brain affects behavior, the treatment of mental health problems such as schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, addiction, psychological development through the lifespan, and they also study the intersection between physical and brain health. They really have many, many areas of expertise. But in addition, they also operate a psychology clinic that provides low-fee therapy and assessment services to adults, children, couples, and families. They also have an infant development program that provides high-quality health care to infants and toddlers of the faculty, staff, and students. By any number of metrics, this department is one of the best departments in the nation and the world. They have the #1 clinical psychology program, #4 social psychology program, #5 behavioral neuroscience program. In fact, overall, this department's usually one of the top 3 in the country. But UCLA, because of this department and what we're doing across campus, is ranked the #6 best global university for psychology and psychiatry. This department is also educating generations to take the next major advances in the field. They host the largest undergraduate major on campus, which is about 3,700 students right now, and they have an incredibly competitive Ph.D. program. So a wonderful program. You're going to meet some of their star faculty, and this series that will be going on this year will continue to introduce across different areas, not all, but a selection of their faculty. So let me introduce you to the chair of this stellar department, Distinguished Professor Annette Stanton. In addition to her appointment in the Department of Psychology, Dr. Stanton is also a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences. She is a senior research scientist at the UCLA Cousins Center for Psychoneuroimmunology and a member of the Division of Cancer Prevention and Cancer Control in the Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center. Her research centers on specifying factors that promote psychological and physical health in individuals who confront health-related adversity, topic particularly relevant to these times. So I want to now please join me in welcoming Dr. Annette Stanton for tonight's event.
Good evening, and thank you for your kind introduction, Victoria. I have the distinct honor of chairing the Department of Psychology, and I'm also delighted to welcome you to this second event in our seminar series, in which we examine the complex and fascinating ways in which brain, mind, and body intersect and change in our socially complex world. I want to thank all of you who submitted questions in advance. We are going to get to some of those today, but due to the large number of attendees, more than 700 at this count, we unfortunately will not be able to take questions from you in real time. We prefer to do that, but we hope you understand. Our hope is that today's event is not only enlightening for you, but also sparks action, whether that's discovering more about the topics of interest or taking steps to improve your own well-being and health. We encourage you to make a difference with the knowledge you gain. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of our psychology faculty who will be speaking with you this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. Castel. Professor Castel is an expert in memory, attention, cognition, and cognitive aging. In his research, he studies how humans remember and why they forget, and how this changes across the lifespan. His research includes strategies to control memory and attention, how our values influence our memory, the psychology of expertise, behavioral models of memory and aging, eyewitness memory, and so on. Please join me in welcoming Professor Castel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you all about this important topic of what we've termed successful aging. And as an overview, I thought I'd share, when people think about aging, oftentimes people have negative attitudes or beliefs about aging. And in fact, as we get older, we probably start to notice our own memory changing. So when I tell people I study memory and aging, people usually share with me their concern that their memory is declining or that they're forgetting names. And I think name recall and name memory is probably the most important thing people notice. So as a reminder, I can remind you, my name is Castel. It rhymes with pastel, like the painter.
Thank you, Alan. We might be having some difficulty with hearing, and so if you are doing that, we hope that our internet connection gets better. We're all speaking from different places, and so hopefully during the questions you can clarify. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Naomi Eisenberger. Dr. Eisenberger specializes in social cognitive aspects of emotion and behavior. Her primary line of research uses neuroimaging techniques to investigate the neural correlates of social rejection and social connection. Through this line of research, she's demonstrated that the experience of social rejection relies in part on physical pain-related neural regions, and that the experience of social connection relies in part on reward-related neural regions in the brain. Her work also examines bidirectional relationships between social relationships and physical health-related outcomes, such as inflammatory processes. Tonight, she's going to talk to us about some very exciting research she's been doing on the concept of generativity and aging. Professor Eisenberger?
Thank you so much, Annette. It's a pleasure to be here. So my work focuses on the emotional experiences that arise in our closest social relationships, as well as how these experiences map onto health. And in some ways, the kind of research that I've been doing has changed in line with my own development. So in my 20s and graduate school, I was very interested in why rejection hurts, since rejection is a primary concern in young adulthood. And here we found some evidence that the brain processes rejection in a manner very similar to the way that it processes physical pain. So much so that we were able to show that Tylenol, a physical painkiller, can actually reduce the painful feelings of social rejection as well. Later on, when I became a mother, I turned my attention to the fulfilling experience associated with giving to others. In other words, why do we engage in caregiving and altruistic behavior? And here we've been able to show that different kinds of prosocial behavior, so helping or supporting other people, activates basic reward-related regions, the same ones that are active when we taste something sweet or when we win money. And then now, with my son being a teenager and graduating to that stage of life where I am not so needed by him anymore, I've turned my attention to thinking more about growing older and how to continue to stay feeling needed and useful as I age. And being able to stay feeling needed and useful does become an issue as we age. So older adults, because of retirement and changing social landscapes, can lose important sources of being productive members of society and can sometimes wind up feeling less needed by others. And this is a problem because we know that feeling needed or useful to others is really important. People who feel more useful to others have better health and they live longer lives. And so to look at this more closely, we recently conducted a study to see if we could help older adults feel more useful to others by increasing their feelings of generativity. And this is just a fancy word for describing a focus on contributing to others, especially younger generations. And in thinking about what older adults have to contribute, we focused on their vast experience and wisdom that they have from just living life. And we asked them to share these experiences with younger generations. So to do this, we brought in older women between the ages of 60 and 86, and we randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. So in our key generativity condition, they were asked to write about their advice and their life experiences, and we're told that this advice would be shared with middle-aged adults. In the control condition, they just wrote about neutral topics like what they had for lunch that day. Each group did this kind of writing once a week for 6 weeks, each time about a slightly different topic. And then we also had them complete questionnaires before and after the intervention to see how their well-being was changing. And we drew blood before and after to see how their immune systems were changing. What we found is that this really simple intervention seemed to be helpful. So women who were in this generativity condition, they showed reductions in feelings of depression, anxiety, and stress. They also started engaging in more social activities and some more physical activities. And in addition, women who tended to have more positive expectations about aging and mental health, so women who didn't just believe that everyone gets depressed as they get older, they showed bigger reductions in loneliness and bigger increases in social support as a function of having gone through this intervention. And then importantly, women in our generativity condition also showed decreases in inflammatory biology. And this is really important because we know that inflammation is implicated in many diseases of aging, like heart disease, diabetes. And so to the extent that generativity can reduce these inflammatory outcomes, it suggests that this kind of intervention may have broader health benefits. So altogether, these findings suggest that increasing feelings of generativity may improve the health and well-being of older adults, and they point to a pretty simple, low-cost way to improve health and well-being as we age.
Thanks so much, Professor Eisenberger. It's fascinating that you really investigate the intersections, mind, body, and health. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Ted Robles. Dr. Robles' research involves understanding how stress and social relationships influence health, with a focus on both processes that help individuals achieve physiological stability during stressful events and processes that help us restore as we recover from a stressor. Dr. Robles studies these biological processes in the context of stress, social support, and intimate relationships across the life course. Today, he's going to be talking about some fascinating research regarding biological aging and psychological constructs. Welcome, Professor Robles.
Great, thanks. It's wonderful to be joining this wonderful group today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some recent work that actually just got accepted for publication last week, which is exciting, on stress and our close romantic relationships and how that might be related to the biology of aging. So a major focus in the biology of aging is finding markers of aging in our bodies and our cells that explain why and how we age. And one biological hallmark of aging is something called cellular senescence. The 30-second explanation is that in many systems in our body, like the immune system, a key part of normal functioning is that individual cells divide and they make copies of themselves over and over. But there comes a point where cells don't make copies of themselves anymore. And when they stop doing that, they don't work as well. One of the things they do is they pump out a lot of inflammation, as Naomi described. This is called cellular senescence, and part of the aging process involves the increased accumulation of these senescent cells. Now, a critical signal that initiates cellular senescence is a protein in cells called P16. Its job is to slow the process of cell division, and aging researchers all over the world are looking at whether cells, having a lot of cells expressing P16, including immune cells, might predict poor health down the road. What we were interested in was whether our responses to stress, so how much things that happen to us feel uncontrollable, difficult to manage, how much those responses were related to the expression of the gene that codes for P16 in immune cells. So we looked at this in 73 parents. They're about the same or similar age as Alan and Naomi and myself. These are all people who had children between the ages of 8 and 13. We measured stress in a number of different ways, and across all of these different measures, these are all either self or interview reported, parents who reported feeling less able to control their lives, who reported more stress, had higher expression of this gene that codes for P16. This cellular senescence marker. And we were the first to report links between stress and P16 expression. Now, deep down, I'm really interested in our close relationships and how they can be a resource for us during stressful times. And one important feature of our close romantic relationships is they help us feel safe and valued and loved. And the more connected we feel with other people, particularly people who make us feel loved, that should benefit our health and well-being. And I mention this to you because we looked at closeness in a very interesting way, and I have to use a visual aid for this. So I'm going to show you. So hopefully you can see this measure here. We had people basically choose a picture that describes their relationship with their intimate partner. And so you can see the circles on the right, they're either very far apart over here, or they're close together. And then these circles down here are very close together. So you can think about which of these sets of circles best describes your relationship. And what we found is that the folks up top here, where there's some closeness but not a lot, they show a stronger association between greater perceived stress and more P16. But the folks at the bottom who show high levels of closeness, there's no relationship at all between perceived stress and P16 expression. And this is in line with the idea that the negative physiological effects of stress could be buffered by closeness with others. Though we need much more and much better data to really firmly establish this as a scientific fact. So if you were to ask me about, what I think are some really important ways to kind of achieve successful aging, I think the biggest thing that I can think of comes from a quote by Carl Reiner, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. And he said that the key to longevity is interacting with people. And I think interacting with close others who make you feel loved and for whom you do the same is a critical part of that process. So look forward to further discussion with everybody.
Thank you, Professor Robles. I'm sure that all of us are fortunate enough to have it be in an intimate relationship or figuring out where we are on those concentric circles. I do want to give a couple of minutes to Professor Castel, who did have trouble with us hearing. And so I'd like to welcome him back on to highlight the most important points in his research. Welcome back, Professor Castel.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Just to summarize, our research looks at how people selectively remember and how that changes with age. So we're very interested in, despite some cognitive decline, whether older adults can select.
I'm afraid we're still having technical difficulties with the audio. So hopefully, perhaps you can come back with us, Alan, and see if we can get you more online.
I can try one more time. Is that any better?
Try it one more time so far.
Third time's the charm. Well, we're interested in how people can selectively remember, and despite changes that happen as we get older, older adults will often complain about not being able to remember names. We've found that older adults can selectively remember things that they feel that are important to them. And this can range from whether it comes to bird watching or names of grandchildren or the price of a grocery item they purchased yesterday. And so we're interested in how memory changes in a selective fashion as we get older, and what sorts of things older adults can selectively remember. And this is almost in contrast to college students who might have had good memory, but have difficulty focusing on what's important, might highlight a lot in the textbook. So we're actually looking at some of the benefits that aging might confer. And maybe this is a sign of wisdom even, that as we get older, we're better at selectively focusing on what's most important to us and kind of placing our resources there. So we're interested in how people can do that in an effective way.
Thank you so much. What I'd like to do now is to bring everyone of our speakers online again. And I have a number of questions from the audience who submitted in advance. And I also have a couple of questions of my own. Let's start with one that has to do with a theme in the research of all three of you. And I noticed that one of the themes really is your research highlights the capacity as we age to focus on meaningful aspects of our experience and our relationships, the process of generativity, giving to others, the lack of stress in our lives, and how relationships can help with that, both on the psychological and the physiological level. The capacity to remember things that we actually value. So my question is it possible to cultivate that capacity, to actually do those kinds of capacities intentionally? And how might we do that as we age? And I'll start with Naomi.
Okay. So I think, one thing that we can do to cultivate these things is just explicitly thinking about what it is in our life that provides us with meaning. We got to sort of do this in our study where we asked these older adults to provide us with their advice on life. What's interesting is we're now going back to reanalyze their writings. So we have all of these writings from them, which we've really done nothing with, and we're now going back to take a look at them. And what's really interesting is that different people get meaning out of different things. So for some people, they're saying the most meaningful thing to them are being with family and friends. And for other people, they're saying the most meaningful thing for them is to have lifelong learning and continue to have new experiences. And it's actually possible that, perhaps some of the benefits that we saw in our study were not just due to these older adults helping others, but maybe figuring out in some ways what is meaningful to them. So I think one of the things that could be really useful is taking the time to maybe write about or think about or talk about with someone else, what are the things that make your life meaningful? Because it may be different from person to person.
Thank you. And Professor Castel, what can we do in terms of our cognitive function as we age to really both enhance our cognitive function and then focus on the things that are most important?
Yeah, I think that's something we're all concerned about at any age, is how to enhance our cognitive abilities. And I think one thing is education. So having lifelong learning is incredibly important. Stimulation, trying new things, and sometimes this puts us outside of our comfort zone. Another thing that's incredibly important and sometimes overlooked is physical exercise. And there's good research showing that people who walk regularly have better memory, and even randomized controlled trials where people who don't walk regularly then start walking 3 to 4 times a week. And when you compare this group to a group that does something like stretching, which is still an exercise but doesn't involve the cardiovascular component as much, you see big changes in the hippocampus, the part of the brain that's very involved in memory. And so even though the hippocampus tends to decline by about 1% after the age of 50, in the walking group, you actually find an increase in the volume of the hippocampus by about 2% after the first year of engaging in this walking exercise. So some of these things are fairly simple. And I think the challenge is knowing how you can engage in them. I think another tip that's useful is there's no one thing that's going to fix everything. And I think having a more balanced approach is a challenge. And when I wrote a book called Better with Age, I interviewed a lot of influential people, partly to look at who are good mentors for aging. And if you have someone you admire, whether it's a famous comedian or grandparent, I certainly admired my grandparents for different reasons. You can start to look at what things seem to work for them, but also what things didn't work. And I think that gives you some insight and motivation. And I think one thing that's often overlooked is balance. After the age of 65, more than 1 in 4 Americans are going to experience a fall. And that's just a trip and fall on the way to the bathroom, slipping on a rug. That can result in a broken hip, hospitalization, and then you're not walking. And if you're not walking, your hippocampus starts to shrink. So memory can start to decline. So I think all of these things are related, and there's a lot we can do at the psychological level to ensure that we age well.
Thank you. Professor Robles, what about cultivating the capacity that you're talking about?
Well, I think about a couple of things that connect with both Alan and Naomi's work. One is, and Naomi kind of described this, knowing what your values are and what's important to you and getting a sense of that. And we know from Alan's work that that people continue to draw on what is important to them when they are, trying to remember things. And the reason I say that is that I think the only thing I would add is that one really great way to kind of draw on your values, take advantage of your abilities and skills, and then to help kind of make the world a better place is to use those things together to improve the world and to do it with other people. Because the more you engage with others, that gets you the walking, that gets you the generativity. And I think that would be the main thing I would add is, the more that you can work together with other people towards, improving your little lot of the world would be a great way to add meaning to life.
Thank you. So meaning, purpose, getting our steps in, balance, focusing on our primary values. I think that these are really all important things for us to do. We should all go out and take a walk in this evening after this panel. Now, the four of us who are talking here, we're fortunate to have jobs that we love as psychological scientists who work with terrific UCLA undergraduates and graduate students. How does your research address the process of aging for people who aren't so fortunate, who might be experiencing financial hardship, a lack of close relationships, racial injustice, especially during the pandemic that we're experiencing now? What can your research say to groups that are potentially have more difficult conditions? And Alan, would you like to start with that one?
I think it's a challenge at many levels, starting from having social connections, because social connections are incredibly important. It's the kind of thing, once you lose a job or once you stop going to school, a lot of our social connections are tied to our professional pursuits. And this can happen whether you're young or old. A lot of older adults, when they retire, become more aware that a lot of their social connections were at the workplace, or that's where they felt valued. So I think what can happen during, these unusual situations is we'll spend a lot of time around, sometimes our closer family, which has many benefits, but also we know can be challenging, and lose these connections, these very important connections, sometimes these just casual conversations that we might have with people in a workplace or a social setting or in a classroom. And so finding ways to cultivate those connections can be both incredibly challenging, but also important. And I think, even just a random phone call, I think physical exercise is the kind of thing that can put you in a better mood, improve your memory. And if you can engage with someone else to challenge you to do it, or if you can meet with someone, I've seen people walking on opposite sidewalks. So they're still in, they can communicate shouting across the road through a mask. Anything you can do to make those connections happen, but it takes a lot of effort.
And Professor Robles, I know you have an important review and talk about relationships as a public health priority and the difficulty of social isolation. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. So one of the things I think is important to point out too is that, as you talked about, inequities in society exist, and as they relate to the biology of aging, we know that the same societal inequities that we're all concerned about in terms of race and income, those also promote faster biological aging. And just because you overcome those inequities, so we know we can all think of stories of people who've overcome great odds to be successful or to make it out of the difficult circumstances in which they're in. And one thing to note is just because they've made it out doesn't mean that that there isn't an imprint of that inequity on them. And so there's research on what some call skin deep resilience, where you have African-American youth who've been able to elevate themselves out of poverty, but they still show the same kind of health issues or underlying biological, like inflammatory biology that you might see for someone who didn't lift themselves out. And so I think that's where both the social relationship piece becomes important, and also just this broader idea of helping reduce burden, because it takes a lot of work to overcome racism and discrimination and residential segregation, you name it. And just because you overcome those things does not necessarily mean that you're free of accelerated biological aging. And so the degree to which people can find each other and connect around just to be a resource for one another. I think of the Bill Withers tune, Lean on Me, help me carry your load, help us, what are ways that we can build our societies so that we can reduce the burden on people who are trying to come up out of low income. And so that way they don't incur the same kind of biological aging through the stress and strain of racism and discrimination. And people that they can connect with to share that burden, whether it be emotional, informational, et cetera, are a really critical resource for that. And finding ways to cultivate that, as you pointed out, from a public health perspective, it's a really important way to shield us from the kind of things we're facing right now.
Thank you. And Professor Eisenberger, I think part of your results really tell us that something about giving to younger generations might be helpful as a buffer against both psychological and physical kinds of aging. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about how people might be able to give wisdom away?
Yes. One thought, and this is sort of specific to what we're dealing with now with COVID and everyone's home and separated. One really successful thing, especially for older adults, is volunteering. Volunteering is really helpful for physical health, for mental health. How to volunteer right now is trickier. I did look up today, there are opportunities through AARP to do strictly online volunteering. But it did occur to me, and if anyone out there in our virtual audience is interested in talking about this with me more, I'd be happy to talk about it more, because I'd really like to do something. It seems we're presented with this opportunity during this pandemic. So we have older adults who are now getting a lot more comfortable with Zoom. My mom, who's in her 70s, she has monthly book club meetings and meditation group meetings with her older friends. And so that is the way that things happen now. We also have a population of kids who are probably, a lot of them, not going back to school in the fall. And so it occurred to me, could there be a way to take advantage of this situation to perhaps through our Zooming or some kind of online interaction, have older adults helping kids with homework, giving parents a break? I don't know if this is actually possible, but it occurred to me that this could be a really nice way to help kids who are dealing with distraction and they're not in school, to help older adults sort of give and find more meaning, and then also to help parents who probably need a break during this challenging time.
Many of us need a break for lots of reasons during this challenging time. Now, many students, and this also comes from an audience member, but personally from me too. Many students in my own husband's high school class really think that 50 is pretty ancient, which is sort of too bad, because it's my husband's 65th birthday today. Happy birthday. But then we also hear about people like Diana Nyad, who was the first person to swim 110 miles from Cuba to Florida, and she was 64 when she did that. I'm interested in how your research bears on stereotypes and expectations about aging and what effects that has. And I think, Professor Eisenberger, your research directly bears on that. Could you talk a little bit more about expectations about aging and how that influences us?
Yeah, sure. So in our study, where we're looking at, generativity and its effects on health and both physical and mental health, we measured our subjects' expectations about aging. So in the mental health domain, we asked them questions like, do you expect that you'll get more lonely and depressed as you get older? People who have positive expectations about aging and mental health don't just assume they're going to get depressed and lonely as they get older. And this seemed like a really important variable for certain outcomes. So it was only for those individuals who had these positive expectations of aging where they showed, decreases in loneliness and increases in feeling supported as a function of our intervention. And it turns out that our expectations about aging, which we sort of collect over our lifetime, 40s, 50s, childhood, can be really impactful. I was looking through the research on this prior to this meeting today, and there's some studies showing that, if you measure expectations about aging, in 50-year-olds, this goes on to predict mortality. And in one of these studies, people who have more positive expectations of aging are living almost 8 years longer. So it really does seem to be an important predictor, not in my work, but in lots of people's work, and I think also in Alan and Ted's work as well.
Thank you. Professor Robles or Castel, would you like to add?
I can quickly say something about some of the work we did. Actually, a former graduate student of mine who actually now works at, she's sort of a scientist working at a healthcare company, which is kind of really cool. She was really interested in these expectations about aging, as Naomi described, and how they were related to making new friends in later life. And so what she did is she was able to get data from a study that actually is very similar to something that Naomi talked about. This is the Experience Corps trial, where older adults, primarily African-American women in Baltimore, they were randomly assigned to volunteer in elementary schools or not. What we looked at was whether expectations about aging were how that was related to making new friends over a 2-year period. And the long story short is that if for the women who, or for the older adults who had more positive expectations about aging, they made about 6 to 8 new friends over a 2-year period, compared to the adults who had more negative expectations about aging, who made about 2.5 to 4 new friends on average over that same period. And you not only see this in terms of like these sort of what we would call weak ties, acquaintance level, but even the number of people that they talk to and refer to as close friends, that even went up among people who had more positive expectations about aging. And that literature, I come away with the same reaction as Naomi. It's sort of astounding how much these attitudes towards aging across a variety of outcomes, including the same inflammatory biology that both of us study and mortality, the attitudes we have about aging have potentially profound consequences for health, cognition, and so on. It's really quite astounding.
Thank you. Professor Castel, would you like to add? I have a follow-up question. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I think our expectations regarding aging are certainly influenced by our role models for aging. So if you think of your parents or grandparents or others, those can be the first role models you turn to. And some people grow up in a household where they live with a grandparent. So I certainly had role models as grandparents, but I've also talked to a lot of older adults who are inspiring, like John Wooden or Maya Angelou, people who do amazing things. And it's not that they're defying their age, they're working with their wisdom.
Thank you. And we are going to be able to send the audience a reference to Professor Castel's book, which is a really remarkable and very useful book. I do have to ask a follow-up question though. So my positive attitudes are important about aging. But let's say I'm somebody who actually saw my parents have chronic conditions very early on. Aging was a very difficult process for them. And maybe even I have some of the chronic conditions that they have, even if I were, 40 or 50. So is it the positive attitude? Is it really what I've experienced in my life and I may myself be experiencing that? Does positive attitudes overcome some of that kind of role modeling or experience that I had in childhood?
You may have to call on someone. Or
are these kinds of factors controlled in the studies so that we rule them out as the kind of explanatory variables?
So I can say that it seems sort of magical in some ways when you look at some of these studies, that these expectations can lead to living longer. I think if you think about how it might actually work in real life, if I have negative expectations and I just assume that I'm going to fall apart as I age, and then I have an injury and I'm like, oh, well, that's just a part of aging. I don't see the doctor. I don't do the physical therapy to help get over it. That's probably part of what's going on, is that, if you have negative expectations and things start to turn bad, you don't try to fix them. In the studies that I've seen in terms of the health of the person, so when they look at expectations of aging and how that predicts physical health, they account for the person's health in the moment. So it's not just that people who are less healthy have more negative expectations about aging.
I see. So it really is something on top of my own physical condition, how I see how I'm going to get older.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I was just going to mention sort of an interesting parallel to this is if you think about something like personality, which we all think of as something that's just sort of stable. But if you ask personality researchers, they'll tell you, one, it can move around. And two, in order to be able to change it, you have to kind of think that it can change. And so I think that's very much exactly in line with what Naomi talked about, which is that in order to make changes that benefit your health, whether it be exercise or improving your balance, you have to kind of buy into that. And not having a lot of buy-in, motivation to believe that improving your balance might have some benefit in reducing fall risk. If the buy-in is not there, the follow-through isn't going to be either. And I think that's partly where these expectations come into play. In addition to, you make a really good point that many of these expectations are born out of experience, right? And so if you carry a lot of experience of caring for older adults, we know that that is related to our stress biology. And so that can definitely be part of it too.
And you talk about personality characteristics changing. One of our audience's questions was, if someone hypothetically is a crotchety and arrogant young person, is it possible for them to become a compassionate and kind and giving older person? Is there any hope for that crotchety young person?
If it was the person that asked the question, then yes.
And Ted, I think part of what you're saying too, it reminds me of that old joke. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change.
That's exactly right.
and so really we're talking about the will to make those kinds of changes in your life. Alan, go ahead. Professor Castel, I think you had many examples in your book of people who did make some transformations later in life. Can you talk about those? That capacity?
Sure, and I think some of these changes can even happen early in life. I thought one of my favorite interviews was Jack LaLanne. And he was someone who had to overcome a lot of physical disabilities to become someone who was very much into fitness and a role model for many during a time where people didn't really think that was the right thing to do in many ways. So I think the people we're around make a big difference. So if you feel like you have challenges, maybe talk to other people who might experience these same challenges. Or, if you're going to a class, an exercise class, a senior's exercise class can be very rewarding. Maybe not now, but there are some simple things you can do even at home. And one thing I always say, people say, my memory is declining. I ask them, well, how about your balance? I think that's not something people are even aware of. You don't notice your balance until it's gone. So I know this is an example Naomi loves to hear, but I always tell people I've learned from an older adult from these many interviews to brush my teeth standing on one leg. And it's my balance test. I do it for 30 seconds on one leg, and then I switch to the other leg. And some days I'm good at it, and some days I'm not. And I've noticed my balance has gotten much better. I've actually graduated to doing this on a small trampoline I have at home as well. So that's how I'm getting creative during COVID times.
On a trampoline?
Yeah, I don't have the trampoline with me, but I'm not balancing right now. But I feel like we can challenge ourselves. And these are really small challenges that you can do at home. You can show off to your friends that you do it. You can share with your friends how you can balance for long periods of time. It doesn't cost any money. You don't need to, go to a yoga class, although that can be great. Tai Chi can be great. But I think there's a lot of things we can do that are quite small, and those are the small things that can make a big difference ultimately.
And so we're talking about a lot of things that people can do in terms of behavior. We also have a question from the audience about, are there strides being made in anti-aging medications? None of us do that research, but I know that Professor Robles has a background in clinical health psychology, and perhaps you want to comment on that.
Well, I could say that my collaborator on this P16 work, Jude Carroll, who's at the Cousin Center for Psychoneuroimmunology, is sort of my go-to expert on, and we work together on a lot of projects. And I remember her giving a guest lecture in my class my graduate course on aging that I teach, and she talked about these medications called senolytics, which is sort of anti-cellular senescence medications, and that indeed in animal models they're starting to show promise in that you sort of take away these senescent cells, and that you might actually be able to kind of push aging back a little bit. Now, the social determinants of health person in me says that's great. At the same time, if we think about issues related to equity, who's going to have the benefit of being able to use senolytic medications? It's going to be people who have access to very expensive medications, and that's not most people. And so with that, even when, I could see a future perhaps when, 10, 20 years from now, where that might start to be a thing, it doesn't preclude or prohibit, it doesn't rule out all the things that Alan mentioned that are these small things, but really are big things. And not to mention the fact that, if we are able to prolong our lifespan, we still have to deal with each other for a long time. And so that doesn't preclude having to do things that are purposeful and generative and, having long, healthy relationships with your significant other that you're with for 50 plus years or more. Those things will still be very important things, and that's what psychology really has to contribute, even in an environment where maybe we are pushing past 100 very frequently.
And Ted, what are examples of senolytic medications? Are these things we've heard of, or they're new drugs?
Yeah, so they're ones that target, let's say certain cells have markers on the outside of them that might be, I don't know if they're antibodies per se that could then target those cells, but these are basically ones that could target some aspect of the senescence process or the cells themselves and kind of get rid of them basically.
But are the drugs things like that we've heard of?
No. So yeah, that's a good question. So no, because of the target. The targets are relatively new. So not even like the anti-cytokine ones. Those wouldn't be what that they're looking at.
Something I know that Professor Eisenberger has done some work in anti-inflammatories, and is there promise in anti-inflammatories in terms of our aging, or should we really focus more on our conditions and our relationships and what we can do?
So we haven't looked specifically at anti-inflammatories in the context of aging. We're about to look at it in the context of loneliness, which is something that becomes potentially more prevalent as we age. But there's a lot of interesting research showing these kind of links, overlapping relationships between loneliness and inflammation. So lonely individuals tend to have heightened levels of inflammation in their body. If we go in and we experimentally increase inflammation, even in young adults, they show increases in loneliness. So once we're out of quarantine and COVID, we're going to be starting a trial looking at whether anti-inflammatories can actually reduce loneliness in a community sample of middle-aged adults.
Thank you. And let's talk for a second. There were some questions about next steps. What are the exciting research questions now with regard to aging in your labs?
I mean, one of the things that we want to do is we want to follow up on this generativity study. And so we've just put in a grant. Our first study in some ways is kind of a small study to see, can we actually make people feel more useful? Does it have any effects? And we're now hoping to study it in a larger sample of older adults, as well as to look more at the neural changes that go on as a function of going through this generativity intervention. So that's one thing that I'm very interested in doing. Also, that idea that I mentioned about hooking up the older adults with the kids, I really want to do that study.
Wouldn't be to benefit you at all, would it? Maybe as a parent. I'm one of those older adults. I'm interested in talking to you. Professor Castel, do you have last words or where your research is going?
Well, we're interested again in how people can selectively focus on what's important, and that's almost, I think, a natural byproduct as we get older, that we realize we can't remember everything, our time is limited, but we want to focus on what's of great interest to us. So we're interested in how curiosity can be harnessed to really improve memory in a selective manner. So you're not going to remember everything. You're going to really hone in on what's important to you and how sharing that information actually might be a very effective way to learn it. There's some interesting research showing that learning to teach something is a very good way to ensure that you remember something. So I think older adults as teachers and lifelong learners can have big implications for how we age.
Thank you. And Professor Robles, last words and new directions?
Sure. So two things we're thinking a lot about. One is that I mentioned this P16 marker. There's actually some other really compelling age-related biological markers that some of our other colleagues at UCLA have pioneered, Steve Horvath in human genetics and biostatistics. So we're going to be going back in our data and looking at epigenetic aging, which is sort of marks on DNA that you acquire over time that are actually well correlated with aging and may predict health. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is connecting that to close relationships through sleep as a mechanism. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but there are some really interesting associations between the quality of your social relationships and the quality of your sleep. And sleep is really important for these biological aging measures. And in addition to the recommendations about exercise and balance, I would definitely add sleep and sort of figuring out how to get it as best you can is a really good thing to be able to to help age successfully. So those are two big directions.
Thank you. And there is research certainly going on at UCLA and elsewhere that shows that we do have very effective methods that are also behavioral and cognitive for helping people sleep better and as well as age better with older populations. So for example, Professor Mike Irwin's research is looking at some of that. I would like you to stay on till to the end as we end. I think I want to highlight how the research in our department has really, it transcends levels. We go from the molecular to social systems. And one of our upcoming events in this series will highlight one of our professors as well as others talking about research and policy work with Black Lives Matter, Professor Vicki Mays. We really span all of these levels, as I'm sure that you all have heard tonight. We really appreciate you joining the conversation. We will be sending out some extra resources. Please keep an eye out for our next series, which will happen early this fall. Thank you all to our panelists. I learned some things and I'm going to balance on one leg. Maybe I can hop on one leg going out of here. That'll probably be pretty good, Alan, huh? And thank you so much for joining our conversation this evening from the Department of Psychology at UCLA. Bye.